Good day, students. Hope you all are remember what we saw in the last class, right? Let's see what are the things you will learn in this session. Okay, the learning outcomes are at the end of this class. You'll be able to recall what happened in the story before, mention who the shoemaker is, define the character of the shoemaker, describe how he reunited with his daughter. Okay, so in the last class, we saw about the shoemaker who visited him in his garage and what he was doing and features about the shoe he was working on, all these things, right? So now let's have a quick recap of the story and we'll continue today's class. The story was written by Charles Dickens. He belongs to the Victorian era. He is an English writer and a social critic. Some of his famous works are The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, A Tale of Two Cities, A Christmas Carol, and Nicholas Nickleby. The story starts with a description about the appearance of the shoemaker, that is, Dr. Manette. He says that he's working on a shoe in his garage. He has some tools, scraps of leather. He had a white beard, very old one and not so long. And his old canvas frock and his clothes were faded to the dull yellow color. It was away from sunlight and air for a very long time. And the shoemaker was giving a very expressionless look to anything and everything he sees. He never looks at things in front of him or speaks without giving such a gaze, strange gaze, expressionless gaze on them. Okay, then Mr. Defarge and Mr. Lorry entered. Mr. Defarge was a former servant of Dr. Manette. Mr. Lorry was a trustworthy friend of Dr. Manette. They had a convo, and Dr. Manette was not able to recognize them. He was very fond of working on the shoe. He says it's a lady's walking shoe he designed in current fashion or trend. He has its pattern in his hand. As he says all these things, he glanced at the shoe and with so much pride. And after giving a long sigh and breaking the knuckles of both the hands, the shoemaker, that is Dr. Manette, was trying very hard in extreme emotion to recall in the hope of some secrets. Okay, now we'll continue. The shoemaker asked, "Did you ask me for my name?" Mr. Lorry said, "Assuredly, I did." 105 North Tower. Is that all? 105 North Tower. With a weary sound that was not a sigh nor a groan, he bent to work again, until the silence was again broken. Here, when Mr. Lorry asks the shoemaker about his name, he answers 105 North Tower. It shows that he has lost his mind, he was mad, he has gone insane, being imprisoned for a long time and in loneliness. "You are not a shoemaker by trade," said Mr. Lorry, looking steadfastly at him. His haggard eyes turned to Defarge, as if he would have transferred the question to him. But as no help came from that quarter, they turned back on the questioner when they had sought the ground. His haggard eyes, haggard means very tired and exhausted. Okay? I'm not a shoemaker by trade. No, I was not a shoemaker by trade. I learned it here. I taught myself. I asked leave to. Okay? He lapsed away, even for minutes, bringing those measured changes on his hands the whole time. His eyes came slowly back at last to the face from which they had wandered when they rested on it. He started and resumed, in the manner of a sleeper that moment awake, reverting to a subject of last night. Here, reverting is returning back to the same place or something. The shoemaker was not sure of his words and his expressions. He lost his mind and his consciousness. He tried to answer Mr. Lorry's question. He stumbled with his words. Then again he answers, saying, I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty after a long while, and I have made shoes ever since. As he held out his hand for the shoe that had been taken from him, Mr. Lorry said, still looking steadfastly in his face, Monsieur Manette, do you remember nothing of me? The shoe dropped to the ground, and he sat, looking fixedly at the questioner. Monsieur Manette, Mr. Lorry laid his hand upon Defarge's arm. Do you remember nothing of this man? Look at him. Look at me. Is that no old banker, no old business, no old servant, no old time rising in your mind, Monsieur Manette? Mr. Defarge asked the shoemaker, that is Dr. Manette, that does he remember anything about him or Mr. Lorry? Mr. Lorry tried to kindle his memories and recall his memories about him and Mr. Defarge, saying that anything about old business, old banker, old servant, and old time. Okay, and the next paragraph. As the captive of many years, captive, okay, captive means prisoner. As the captive of many years sat looking fixedly by turns at Mr. Lorry and at Mr. Defarge, some long obliterated marks of an actively intent intelligence in the middle of the forehead gradually forced themselves through the black mist that had fallen on him. Here, obliterated means obliterated marks of an actively intent intelligence. Obliterated means completely destroyed. Actively intent intelligence means sharp mind. The author tries to prove that the sharp mind of Dr. Manette was completely destroyed and the black mist has fallen on him. Black mist, which means forgetfulness or amnesia. It has fallen on Dr. Manette. They were clouded again. He says that they are gone and overclouded, means dark and gloomy. As you can see in this picture, it's very dark and gloomy. It is overclouded. They were fainter, they were gone, but they had been there. His sharp mind, his intelligence was there before, but not now. Okay, so the next paragraph. And so exactly was the expression repeated on the fair young face of her who had crept along the wall to a point where she could see him. Crept means moving closely and slowly, as you can see in this picture how the little boy is creeping in. Crept is a past tense of creep, okay? So here the young girl, that is Lucy, crept in, okay, along the wall, and she came closer to the shoemaker. And where she now stood looking at him, with hands which at first had been only raised in frightened compassion, if not even to keep him off and shut out the sight of him, but which were now extending towards him, trembling with eagerness to lay the spectral face upon her warm young breast. Here, trembling means shivering or shaking with fear, anxiety, or excitement. And spectral means ghostly or strange. And love it back to life and hope. So exactly was the expression repeated, though in stronger characters, on her young, fair young face, that it looked as though it had passed like a moving light from him to her. So, in this paragraph, the author says that the young girl crept along the wall, moved closely towards Dr. Manette in order to see him. She extended her hands, trembling in fear, anxiety, in order to rest his ghostly face upon her chest. But still, there was no action from the shoemaker, that is Dr. Manette, except from the same repeated expressionless look. Okay? He didn't show any action or expression or response to her. Darkness had fallen on him in its place. He looked at the two, less and less attentively. His eyes, in gloomy abstraction, sought the ground and looked about him in the old way. Gloomy abstraction. Gloomy means dark and abstraction. It means dark scenes flashed in his memories, which made him inattentive. Okay, here abstraction means inattentiveness. Finally, with a deep, long sigh, he took the shoe up and resumed his work. "Have you recognized him, monsieur?" asked Defarge in a whisper. Mr. Manette answered, "Yes, for a moment. At first I thought it quite helpless, but I have questionably seen, for a single moment, the face that I once knew so well. Hush, let us draw further back. Hush." Okay, he said like this. She had moved from the wall of the garret. Garret, you know, right? It's a living space at the top of the floor, house or residential building, very near to the bench on which he sat. There was something awful in his unconsciousness of the figure that could have put out its hand and touched him as he stooped over his labor. Not a word was spoken, not a sound was made. She stood like a spirit beside him, and he bent over his work. It happened at length, that is for a very long time, that he had occasion to change the instrument in his hand for his shoemaker's knife. It lay on that side of him which was not the side on which she stood. He had taken it up and was stooping to work again. When his eyes caught the skirt of her dress, he raised them and saw her face. The two spectators started forward, but she stayed them with a motion of her hand. She had no fear of his striking at her with the knife, though they had. Here the young girl stood there, and he was again bent over his work. He changed his instrument from the other side. When his eyes caught her skirt, he looked up and saw her face. Mr. Defarge and Mr. Lorry came forward, assuming that Dr. Manette will strike her with a knife in his hand. But she had no fear of that. She stared He stared at her with a fearful look, and after a while his lips began to form some words, though no sound proceeded from them. That is, here proceeded means came out. The author says no words came out from his lips, even after staring at her with a strange look. So that's it. The story ends here. Let's have a quick recap. The story was written by Charles Dickens. He belongs to the Victorian era. He is an English writer and a social critic. Some of his famous works are The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, A Tale of Two Cities, and A Christmas Carol. The story starts with the describing about the appearance of the shoemaker. He was working on a shoe in his garret. He had some tools and scraps of leather. He had a white beard, very old and not so long. His frock and his clothes were tattered, and they are faded to the dull yellow color. Okay, he was always giving expressionless look without any response or action to the person or thing in front of him. Then Mr. Defarge and Mr. Lorry entered. Mr. Defarge is the former servant, and Lorry is a trusted, trustworthy friend of Dr. Manette. They had a conversation, and Mr. Manette was not able to recognize them because he has lost his memories. He was very fond of working in the shoe. He worked on the shoe. It's a ladies' walking shoe design in current fashion, and he glanced at the shoe with such a pride in his eyes. After giving a long sigh than usual, he breaks the knuckles of both the hands, and he was trying very hard in extreme emotion to recall in the hope of some secrets from his memories from his past life. When Mr. Lorry asks the shoemaker about his name, he answers, 105 North Tower. This is the thing he remembers from his memory. 105 North Tower. It shows that he has lost his mind, he has gone insane, being imprisoned for a very long time and in loneliness. The shoemaker was not sure of his words and his expressions. He really lost his mind and his consciousness. When he tried to answer Mr. Lorry's question, he stumbled with his words. Mr. Devaj asked the shoemaker, that is Dr. Manette, that does he remember anything about him or Mr. Lorry. Mr. Lorry tried to kindle his memories about him, saying old business, old banker, old servant, and old time. The author tries to prove that the sharp mind of Dr. Manette was completely destroyed, and black mist, that is the gloomy thing, black mist has fallen on him, which means forgetfulness or amnesia. Black mist here means amnesia or forgetfulness has fallen on Dr. Manette. They were overclouded again. He says that they are gone and they are overclouded means dark and gloomy. Then he says that the young girl crept along the wall in order to see Dr. Manette. She moved closely towards Dr. Manette. She extended her hands, trembling in anxiety or fear, in order to rest his strange, ghostly face upon her chest. But still there was no action or response from the shoemaker, except from the same repeated expressionless look. The young girl stood there, and he was again bent over his work. He changed his instrument from the other side. When his eyes caught her skirt, he looked up and saw her face. Mr. Defarge and Mr. Lorry came forward, assuming that Dr. Manette will strike her with the knife in his hand, but she had no fear of that. He stared at her for moments, but still no words came out of his lips. He couldn't speak anything. The young girl is the daughter of Dr. Manette. She is Lucy. Okay. Dr. Manette lost his consciousness and he has gone insane being a prisoner for many long years. He started making shoes which he learned when he was in prison. Mr. Defarge, who is the old servant of Dr. Manette, and Mr. Lorry, who is the trustworthy of friend of Dr. Manette, they both helped Lucy, the daughter of Dr. Manette, to reunite with her father after so many years. So that's the end of the story. The father and the daughter reunited after being separated by a war field. So by now, you should be able to recall what happened in the story before, mention who the shoemaker is, define the character of the shoemaker, describe how he reunited with his daughter. Okay. Thank you, students. Copy the notes in your classwork. Thank you.